My name is Beth. I'm 32 years old and I teach second grade at a public elementary school in Ohio. I want to tell you about the night my cousin introduced me to her husband's family at Thanksgiving dinner and called me just a babysitter with a classroom. And I want to tell you about the man sitting at the end of that table, a man I had never formally met, who quietly set down his fork and said, "Wait, I know you." But before I get to that, let me tell you a little about where I come from. My mother raised me alone after my dad left when I was 9. We lived in a small house on the east side of Columbus, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business and nobody had much to spare. My mom worked nights at a laundry facility folding linens for hotels. She would come home at 6 in the morning, sometimes smelling like bleach and dryer heat, and she would still make me breakfast before I went to school. She never complained. Not once. I decided I wanted to be a teacher when I was 11 years old. My third grade teacher, Mrs. Alderton, stayed after class with me twice a week for an entire semester to help me with reading. I had fallen behind. Some combination of stress at home and undiagnosed anxiety that nobody caught until much later. And she noticed before anyone else did. She didn't make a big deal of it. She just stayed. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she would pull out a chair beside mine and say, "Okay, let's pick up where we left off." That's all. No fanfare, no phone calls home, just time. I never forgot that. I decided right then that I wanted to be the person who stayed. So I put myself through college on loans and a part-time job at a grocery store, got my degree in elementary education, and started teaching at Birchwood Elementary 7 years ago. I love my job in the way that's hard to explain to people who don't understand it. Not every day is good. Some days are genuinely exhausting and heartbreaking and thankless. But then a kid who couldn't read 3 words in September stands up in December and reads a full sentence out loud to the class, and the look on that child's face, that specific look, makes everything else disappear. That's my whole life, basically. A small house, a classroom full of 7-year-olds, and a job I chose on purpose. My cousin Adrian had a very different life. Her mother, my mother's sister, married well the second time around, and Adrian grew up in a different world than I did. Private school, European vacations, a car for her 16th birthday. I don't hold any of that against her. Not exactly. But Adrian developed a very particular way of looking at people over the years. A way of sorting them quickly into categories based on what they did and how much it paid. She was friendly enough on the surface. She hugged you when she saw you, asked about your life, laughed at the right moments. But underneath that, there was always this quiet measurement happening, a constant appraisal. She married a man named Richard last spring. He came from a well-off family in Pennsylvania. His father had spent decades running a regional construction company, and his mother had been involved in local politics for years. They were a serious family. The kind of family that filled a room with a certain weight. Adrian invited me to Thanksgiving at her in-laws' house in Pittsburgh. She had called me the week before, and during the call she said, "It's going to be a big family dinner. My husband's parents, his sister, some of their close family friends." Then she paused and added, almost as an afterthought, "Just dress nicely, okay? These are not casual people." I said I would. I drove to Pittsburgh on Wednesday night and stayed at a small hotel near the highway. Adrian had offered me a room at the house, but something told me to keep my own space. I've learned over the years to trust that instinct. The house was large and well decorated in the way that old money tends to be. Not flashy, just solid and expensive and permanent. Dark wood furniture, oil paintings, bookshelves that actually had books on them. Richard's mother, a composed woman in her 60s named Helen, greeted me warmly at the door and said she was glad I came. She seemed genuine. I liked her right away. There were about 14 people all together around that table. Adrian sat near the center with Richard beside her, glowing. She was in her element, surrounded by comfort and elegance and people who matched her idea of a good life. I found a seat near the far end of the table, between an older cousin of Richard's and a quiet man in his late 50s who introduced himself simply as Frank, an old friend of the family. Dinner was beautiful. Helen had clearly put a lot of care into it. Turkey, roasted vegetables, sweet potatoes, 3 kinds of pie. The conversation flowed easily. Travel, local news, a construction project Richard's father was proud of. I mostly listened and contributed when something came up that I could speak to. Then Adrian stood up. She did it the way she always did things, with a kind of cheerful confidence that filled the room. She tapped her wine glass lightly and said, "I just want to take a moment to introduce some of my family, since not everyone knows each other yet." She introduced her mother first, then an uncle. Then she turned toward me. "And this," she said, with a smile that touched every corner of her face except her eyes, "is my cousin Beth." I smiled. A few people nodded in my direction. "Beth is a school teacher," she continued, and then she laughed a little. Not a mean laugh. More of a breezy, dismissive one, the kind you use when you're trying to make something sound small without sounding cruel. Second grade. She takes care of little kids all day. She paused. Basically a professional babysitter, but with, lesson plans. A few people chuckled. Someone near the middle of the table said, "Oh, how sweet," in a voice that wasn't particularly interested. Richard smiled the way people smile when they don't know what else to do. I didn't move. I kept my expression neutral, and I looked down at my plate for just a moment, and I thought about the 31 students I had sent home before the holiday break with handwritten notes tucked into their backpacks. I thought about Marcus, my student who had come to school in September barely speaking in full sentences and who had stood up in October and given a 2-minute presentation about his dog. I thought about that, and I breathed, and I smiled back at Adrian. "Thanks," I said. "I love my job." The moment passed. Conversations resumed. Plates were passed. Adrian moved on to other introductions and the warmth of the dinner settled back over the room. But then something happened. Frank, the quiet man sitting beside me, put down his fork. Not abruptly, just carefully, like he was suddenly somewhere else in his mind and had forgotten he was holding it. He turned very slightly in my direction, not staring, just looking, the way you look at something you're trying to place, like a song you almost recognize. I noticed but didn't say anything. I poured water into my glass and listened to the conversation on the other side of the table. A minute passed. Then 2. Then Frank said, quietly, almost to himself, "Second grade." I turned toward him. "Sorry?" He shook his head a little. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to be strange. When she said second grade, something caught in my mind." He paused. "You teaching Columbus?" "Yes," I said. "Birchwood Elementary." Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic man. But his eyes went still, and he set his napkin down very slowly beside his plate. "Birchwood," he repeated. "Yes. Have you heard of it?" He didn't answer right away. He picked up his water glass, put it back down without drinking, and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at me. "What's your last name?" "Callahan," I said. He was quiet for so long that the man across from us glanced over to see if something was wrong. "Are you all right, Frank?" Helen asked from further down the table. "Yes," he said. "Perfectly fine. I apologize." He smiled at her briefly, then turned back to me. His voice was low, meant only for me. "Miss Callahan, do you remember a student about 4 years ago, maybe 5, a little boy named Cooper?" My chest tightened before I even fully processed the name. Because yes, I remembered Cooper. Cooper had been in my class 5 years ago. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with a face that was always a little too serious for someone so young. He came to school every day in the same 2 or 3 shirts, rotating. He never brought lunch. He was quiet in the way that worried me. Not shy quiet, but careful quiet, watchful quiet. The kind of quiet that a child learns when home is not a safe place to make noise. I started keeping extra snacks in my desk drawer the second week of school. I told him I always made too much and needed someone to help me finish it. He looked at me the first time I said that, really looked at me, with this expression I've carried with me ever since, like he was deciding whether to believe me. Then he took the granola bar and he said thank you, and that was that. Over the next several months, I documented what I saw. I talked to the school counselor. I made phone calls that felt uncomfortable and necessary, and eventually, after a process that was long and imperfect and hard, Cooper was placed with his grandfather, A man who drove 4 hours to come get him and cried in the school parking lot when the counselor walked Cooper out to his car. I never met that man. I only saw him from the window of my classroom. Yes, I told Frank. I remember Cooper. Frank looked at me for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "He's my grandson." The table around us had not stopped exactly, but something in our corner had gone still. Richard's father, a perceptive man, had noticed the change in Frank's demeanor and was watching us without appearing to watch. "Cooper is 11 now," Frank said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "He plays soccer. He's reading above grade level. Last month, he told me his favorite book is Charlotte's Web. He said his teacher read it to his class when he was 7. I pressed my lips together. I remembered reading that book to my class that year. I remembered Cooper sitting cross-legged on the carpet, leaning forward, completely absorbed. "How is he?" I asked. "He's good," Frank said, and the way he said it, 2 words, simple and whole, carried everything. "He's really, truly good." I had to look down at my plate for a second. I don't cry easily, but that moment asked something of me that I didn't have full control over. "I'm glad," I said. "I thought about him a lot." "I still do." Frank straightened in his chair. His voice was still low, but something in it had changed. A kind of resolve, or maybe just the weight of something he had been carrying for years, finally finding a place to land. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I want to tell you something." He paused. I didn't know what was happening to my grandson for a long time. I lived far away, and I didn't know. By the time I found out, by the time anyone told me, it had already been going on for over a year. He stopped. "I can't think about that year too much. It does something to me." He looked at the table. "But what I do think about is the day I drove to Columbus to pick him up. And the counselor told me that there had been a teacher, his classroom teacher, who had noticed, who had kept records, made calls, pushed when pushing, was uncomfortable. She told me that without that teacher, the situation could have gone on much longer. His jaw was tight. That teacher was you." The table had gone quiet around us. Not all at once. Gradually, the way a room quiets when something real is happening and people feel it before they understand it. Helen had stopped talking. Richard had turned in his chair. Even Adrian had gone still, her wine glass held halfway to her mouth and forgotten there. "You probably did not think you were doing anything extraordinary," Frank said. "I imagine you thought you were doing your job." He looked at me directly. "But I want you to know that because of what you did, my grandson came to live with me, and I got to watch him grow up. I got to be there." His voice dropped. "That is not a small thing. That is everything." The silence around the table was complete. I didn't know what to say. I never know what to say in moments like that, which is maybe strange for someone whose entire job is communication. But there's a category of gratitude that language doesn't quite reach, and Frank's voice was sitting right at the edge of it. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. "Genuinely," Frank nodded. Then he picked up his fork, very deliberately, and went back to eating. But his eyes were bright. Richard's father cleared his throat gently. He looked at Adrian. His voice was not unkind, but it was clear. "Your cousin," he said, "has been in my home for 3 hours and has already turned out to be one of the most remarkable people at this table." Adrian said nothing. The color in her face had changed. That particular shade that comes when the ground shifts under a joke you thought was harmless. Helen looked at me with warm, uncomplicated eyes. "What grade do you teach?" "Second," I said. She smiled. "I imagine you're very good at it." The dinner continued. Music came on softly from somewhere in the house. People asked for second helpings of pie. The conversation moved in the way Thanksgiving conversations do, sideways and backwards and into small pockets of laughter. But something had settled differently over the table by then. People looked at me when I spoke, not because I had done anything in that room, but because Frank had told the truth about something, and the truth had weight. Adrian did not come to find me before I left. I gathered my coat and said goodbye to Helen, who pressed my hand in both of hers and said she hoped I would come back. Richard walked me to the door and said, "Thank you for coming. I mean that. I believed him. In the car, driving back toward the highway, I turned on the radio and let the miles unwind quietly. I've had a lot of time since then to think about that evening. About Adrian's comment, which I won't pretend didn't land. Things like that always land, no matter how practiced you get at absorbing them. Being called just a babysitter with lesson plans in front of a room full of strangers, that particular phrasing, delivered with that particular laugh, lands. But here's what I've learned. Over 7 years of sitting in small chairs and paying attention to small people, the most important things are almost never the most visible things. The work that keeps the world from falling apart is usually invisible work. It's the nurse who stays, the social worker who documents, the teacher who notices, the grandfather who drives 4 hours. Nobody puts that kind of work on a dinner party highlight reel. But it's the work that, when the moment finally comes, makes a quiet man put down his fork and say, "I know you. I know what you did." That's enough. That has always been enough. I drove home through the dark and the highway lights, and I thought about Cooper, 11 years old now, reading above grade level, with a favorite book. I thought about the day he took that first granola bar from my desk and looked at me like he was deciding whether to trust something. I thought about how some decisions are made in very small, ordinary moments, a chair pulled close, an extra snack, a phone call you don't want to make but you make anyway. I thought about Mrs. Alderton, staying after class every Tuesday and Thursday, pulling up a chair and saying, "Let's pick up where we left off." And I thought, that's it. That's the whole job. Just stay. Just notice. Just keep showing up. It's not glamorous, it doesn't photograph well. It doesn't make people laugh warmly at dinner parties. But sometimes, if you're lucky and the years are kind and the right person happens to be in the right room, it comes back around, and someone tells you what it meant, and you get to hear it. I'm 32 years old. I teach second grade in Ohio, and I would not trade one single day of it. I've thought about that Thanksgiving dinner more times than I can count since it happened. Not obsessively. Just the way you return to something that clarified things for you. Like a room you walked through once that you keep seeing the layout of when you close your eyes. What Adrian did wasn't dramatic in the way that makes a clean story. She didn't scream. She didn't set out to destroy me. She just laughed, and in that laugh was a whole philosophy. One that says a person's worth is determined by the size of their paycheck and the prestige attached to their title. It's a common philosophy. I've heard versions of it my whole life. What made it sting that particular night was the audience, the setting, the deliberateness of it. She knew exactly what she was doing when she called me a professional babysitter in front of people who had just met me. She was filing me away for them, putting me in a box so they wouldn't have to wonder. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, is that choices have a long reach. Every decision we make sends something forward into time, and we rarely get to see where it lands. I made a decision 5 years ago to stay late, to document carefully, to make phone calls that were uncomfortable and necessary on behalf of a 7-year-old boy who came to school in rotating shirts and never had lunch. I didn't make that decision thinking anyone would ever know. I made it because Cooper was sitting in front of me and he needed someone to notice, and I was the person in the room. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't ask for an audience. It happens in classrooms and hospital rooms and late-night phone calls and early morning parking lots. It happens when nobody is watching, and that's exactly why it's real. Because the things we do when there's no reward coming are the truest things about us. Frank sitting at that table was not justice in any tidy design sense. It was simply the world being large and interconnected in ways none of us fully understand. Cooper's grandfather happened to be a family friend of my cousin's husband. I happened to be invited to that dinner. He happened to hear the word second grade and feel something catch in his memory. 1,000 small facts had to line up for that moment to exist. And because they did, I got to hear that Cooper was 11 and reading above grade level and had a favorite book. That's not a small thing. That's the whole point. Adrian's laugh told me I wasn't impressive. Frank's voice told me that 7 years ago in a classroom in Columbus, I had done something that mattered to a man who would carry it for the rest of his life. Both of those things happened at the same table on the same night. And what I've come to understand is that we don't get to choose which one defines us. Our choices already did that, long before anyone said a word. I think about the students sitting in my classroom right now. I think about which ones are carrying something I haven't seen yet. I think about Mrs. Alderton, who stayed after class for me when I was 11 and struggling, and who probably doesn't know that she's part of the reason I became a teacher. I think about how quietly these things move through time. Do good work. Stay when it's hard. Notice the things that are easy to miss. Not because someone will find out, not because the room will go quiet and a stranger will tell you what it meant, but because the child in front of you is real and the moment is real, and this is the one life you have to do something with. That's enough reason. It has always been enough.